A billionaire walked into a diner. He was testing whether real love still existed. By the end, you'll wonder the same thing.
Daniel Cross had not smiled in front of a camera in 3 years, and yet the tabloids still called him the most eligible man in America. He owned 4 companies, a private island off the coast of Georgia, and a penthouse in Chicago with views that made grown men go quiet. What he did not own, what no amount of money had ever bought him, was a single person who wanted to know him before they knew his net worth. That was the thought sitting in his chest the night his assistant handed him a folder full of headlines calling him cold, calculating, unlovable. He read every word twice. Then he closed the folder and made a decision that would change the rest of his life, though he did not know it yet. His lawyer told him it was reckless. His board told him it was beneath him. His mother, the only person left who spoke to him without an agenda, told him it might be the smartest thing he had ever done. Daniel had spent his whole adult life being courted by women who memorized his stock portfolio before they memorized his birthday. He had proposed once to a woman named Vanessa and found out 4 days before the wedding that she had been feeding details of his prenup to a gossip blog for cash. He never told anyone how much that broke something in him. He simply stopped trying. So he came up with a plan that sounded insane on paper. He would disappear. No driver, no phone with his real number, no watch worth more than a car payment. He would take on a name that meant nothing, wear clothes that told no story, and go live for a season as a man with nothing, in a town where nobody would recognize his face. If a woman could look at him with empty pockets and still choose to be kind, still choose to stay, he would know the difference between being loved and being used. It was not a game to him. It was the only experiment he had left to try. He chose a small town in eastern Tennessee, a place called Millbrook Hollow, population under 6,000, the kind of town with 1 diner, 1 hardware store, and a church on every 3rd corner. He told his company he was taking a sabbatical for his health. He told his mother he loved her and asked her not to worry. Then Daniel Cross became Daniel Cole, a man with a duffel bag, 3 days of stubble, and a story about losing his job and his apartment back in Knoxville. He did not expect the first person to show him kindness would be the last person he ever expected to fall for. Before he left Chicago, Daniel sat in his empty penthouse for a long time, looking at the skyline he had once been so proud to own a piece of. He thought about his father, a man who had built the first cross-logistics warehouse with his own hands and never once let success make him forget what a hard day's work actually cost a person. Somewhere between his father's death and the company's 3rd public offering, Daniel had lost that thread entirely. He had become a name on a building instead of a man who understood what it meant to earn a dollar the slow way. Millbrook Hollow, he told himself, was not an escape. It was an attempt to find his way back to something his father would have recognized. He packed light on purpose. 2 shirts, a pair of worn jeans he bought secondhand specifically so they would not look staged, and a flip phone with a prepaid number that nobody from his old life would ever call. He left his real phone locked in a drawer in his study, along with his watch, his wallet full of black cards, and a note to his assistant that said only, "Do not look for me unless the building is on fire." It was the closest thing to freedom he had felt in 15 years, and it terrified him more than any boardroom negotiation ever had. Grace Hollis had been on her feet since 5 that morning, and by the time the dinner rush hit, her lower back was screaming louder than the diner's ancient coffee machine. She was 36 years old, raising an 8-year-old son named Eli mostly on her own, and working double shifts at the Hollow Diner because the child support checks from Eli's father had stopped coming 18 months ago. She was not a woman who complained. She had learned a long time ago that complaining did not pay the electric bill. It was a Tuesday night, rain coming down sideways against the windows, when she noticed the man sitting alone in the corner booth. He had ordered black coffee and nothing else, and he had been nursing that same cup for over an hour, clearly trying to look busy so nobody would ask him to leave. Grace had waited enough tables in her life to recognize the look on his face. It was the look of a man who was hungry and too proud to say so. She did not ask him if he needed help, because she knew pride when she saw it, and pride does not respond well to pity. Instead, she walked over with a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes that had, according to her, been made wrong and needed to be thrown out anyway. She set it down in front of him and told him it would go to waste otherwise, so he might as well help her out. Daniel looked up at her, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, nobody was performing kindness for an audience. Nobody was doing it for a photograph. She simply did not want to see a hungry man go without, and she had figured out a way to give him food without taking his dignity. He came back the next night, and the night after that. Grace never asked him too many questions, but slowly the pieces came out anyway, the way they always do between two people who are lonelier than they let on. He told her his name was Daniel Cole. He told her he used to work in logistics up in Knoxville before the company folded and he lost the apartment along with it. He told her he was staying at the extended stay motel off Route 9 for now, though the truth was he had rented a small room above the hardware store under a fake name and was paying the owner in cash every week to keep quiet about it. Grace told him about Eli, about the way her son collected bottle caps and wanted to be a marine biologist even though Millbrook Hollow was 4 hours from the nearest ocean. She told him about her ex-husband, a man named Marcus Doyle, who had left when Eli was 5 and resurfaced only when he needed something. She never once asked Daniel for anything. She brought him coffee refills she did not charge for. She saved him the last biscuit at closing. When he mentioned, carefully, that he had put in applications at the auto parts store and the feed mill and heard nothing back, she went home that night and asked her uncle, who ran the mill, if he had any openings. Daniel got the job at the feed mill 2 weeks later, loading 50-pound bags onto pallets for $11 an hour, and it was, without question, the hardest physical work he had ever done in his life. His hands blistered. His back ached in ways his personal trainer back in Chicago would have found almost comical. But there was something underneath the exhaustion that felt like relief, like he was finally standing on solid ground instead of floating somewhere above his own life. Nobody at the mill knew his last name was worth billions. They knew him as the new guy who showed up early and never complained. He started walking Grace home after her shifts when the weather was bad, staying 2 steps behind so nobody in town would talk. He fixed the leaning fence post outside her house without being asked. He taught Eli how to skip rocks at the creek behind the school, and Eli, who had spent 3 years without a steady man in his life, started asking Grace when Daniel was coming by again. Grace told herself she was not falling for him. She told herself this 3 or 4 times a week, usually right before she caught herself smiling at nothing while flipping pancakes at 6 in the morning. If you have ever watched someone let their guard down slowly, one small act of trust at a time, you already know how dangerous and how beautiful that process is. Grace had built walls after Marcus left, tall enough that most men in Millbrook Hollow had stopped trying to climb them years ago. But Daniel never climbed. He simply stood outside the walls and waited, patient in a way that confused her, because patient men were not supposed to exist anymore, at least not in her experience. There were small moments neither of them ever spoke about later, moments that mattered more than either realized at the time. The morning Daniel showed up to Eli's school with a poster board and glue sticks because Grace had a double shift and could not make it to the science fair setup. The evening he sat in the hospital waiting room for 6 hours when Grace's uncle had a scare with his heart, not because anyone asked him to, but because he understood, in a way he had never understood before, that showing up was worth more than any check he could have written. Grace began to notice that Daniel Cole never once complained about the smallness of his life in Millbrook Hollow, never mentioned missing anything from before, and she assumed, reasonably, that a man who had lost everything simply did not have much left to miss. On Sundays, when the diner closed early, the 3 of them started falling into something that looked, from the outside, exactly like a family. Daniel learned how Eli liked his grilled cheese cut into triangles, never squares. He learned that Grace hummed old country songs under her breath when she thought nobody was listening, and that she still wore her grandmother's ring on a thin chain around her neck because her fingers had grown too thin during the hardest years to keep it on properly. These were not the kinds of details a man learns by accident. They were the kinds of details a man learns because he has stopped performing a role and started actually paying attention to another person's life. 3 months into the experiment, Daniel Cross had a problem he had not anticipated. He had fallen in love, and falling in love as a lie was a far more complicated thing than he had imagined when he first packed his duffel bag. Every conversation with Grace was real. Every laugh, every quiet moment on her porch steps after Eli had gone to bed, every single thing between them felt more honest than anything he had experienced in the boardrooms and galas of his old life. And yet the entire foundation of it rested on a lie he told her the very first week they met. He started keeping a small notebook in his room above the hardware store, the kind of notebook he had not used since business school, and in it he wrote down every reason he could think of for why the truth needed to come out on his terms, in his own words, before anyone else had the chance to hand it to her secondhand. Some nights he filled 2 or 3 pages. Other nights, he only managed a single sentence before setting the pen down and staring at the wall, unable to find language honest enough to explain a lie that had grown far larger than he ever intended it to become. He started rehearsing how he would tell her the truth. He imagined a dozen different versions of the conversation, and in every single one, he pictured her forgiving him, understanding why a man who had been burned so badly needed proof before he could trust again. What he did not imagine, not once, was that the truth would come out before he ever got the chance to say it himself. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in October. A reporter from a Knoxville news station, working a slow week, had gotten a tip that Daniel Cross had not been seen in public in months and was rumored to be somewhere in East Tennessee. The story ran as a small local segment, mostly speculation, but it included an old photograph from a charity gala 3 years earlier. The photograph made its way onto a community Facebook group for Millbrook Hollow by dinner time, posted by someone who thought the resemblance to the new guy at the feed mill was kind of funny, right? Grace was folding laundry when her neighbor sent her the link with 3 question marks and nothing else. She almost did not click it. She almost went back to matching Eli's socks. But something in her chest told her to look. The same instinct that had once told her not to marry Marcus Doyle without a longer engagement, an instinct she had ignored back then and regretted for years afterward. This time she listened to it. She stared at the photograph for a long time. The man in the tuxedo, standing under gold chandeliers with a champagne glass in his hand, had the same jawline, the same tired eyes, the same small scar above his left eyebrow that she had asked Daniel about once, and he had brushed off as a childhood accident. It was him. There was no version of this where it was not him. Grace sat down on the edge of her bed and felt something in her chest crack straight down the middle, not because he was rich, but because every single day for 3 months, she had been telling him the truth about her whole life, while he handed her a name that did not exist. She thought about the meatloaf she gave him that first rainy night. The plate, she said, was made wrong, so he would not feel like a charity case. She thought about how she had gone to her uncle, practically begging for a job for a man she believed had nothing, when the whole time he could have bought the entire feed mill with the money in one of his checking accounts. She did not feel foolish for helping him. She felt something worse. She felt used, in the exact way she had spent her whole adult life trying to protect herself and her son from ever being used again. Daniel showed up at her door that evening the way he always did, holding a small bag of the peppermints Eli liked from the gas station down the road. He knew something was wrong the second she opened the door and did not step aside to let him in. Her eyes were red, and her arms were crossed over her chest in a way he had never seen before, not once in 3 months, not even on her worst days at the diner. She held up her phone without a word. He looked at the screen, at the photograph, at the headline calling him a reclusive billionaire, and he felt his stomach drop the way it had not dropped since the day he found out about Vanessa and the tabloid. Except this time, he was the one who had done the deceiving, and there was no version of an apology that could undo 3 months of a lie, no matter how good his reasons had felt at the time. He tried to explain. He told her about Vanessa, about the prenup leaked for cash, about the years of women who wanted the name Cross more than they ever wanted the man attached to it. He told her the experiment was never meant to hurt anyone, that it started as a test of the world and turned into something he never expected, something real, something he did not know how to walk away from, because walking away from her had started to feel impossible. Grace listened to every word standing in her own doorway, arms still crossed, rain starting to fall again behind him. "You let me feel sorry for you," she said finally, her voice low and steady in a way that scared him more than shouting would have. "You let my son teach you how to skip rocks like you'd never had a childhood worth mentioning. You let my uncle give you a job he could have given to somebody who actually needed it. And this whole time, you had a helicopter on standby, didn't you?" Daniel did not deny it. There was nothing to deny. He stood there in the rain and told her the only true thing he had left, which was that he loved her, and that the money had never once made him feel the way one plate of free meatloaf on a rainy Tuesday had made him feel. But Grace had heard enough men explain themselves in her life to know that explanations rarely came with change attached. She told him, quietly, that she needed him to leave, and she closed the door before he could see her start to cry. Word travels fast in a town the size of Millbrook Hollow, and by the following week, everyone at the feed mill knew who Daniel really was. Some of his co-workers laughed it off, joking that he still owed them lunch money he had borrowed the month before. Others grew distant, uncomfortable being around a man who had spent 3 months pretending to need the same $11 an hour they genuinely needed to survive. Daniel understood their discomfort even as it stung. He had not meant to mock anyone's struggle. He had only wanted, for once in his life, to know what it felt like to be seen without a price tag attached to his name. He kept working at the mill anyway. He did not run back to Chicago, did not call his driver, did not touch the private jet sitting fueled at a regional airport 40 minutes away. Something in him refused to let this become just another failed experiment he could walk away from with his dignity mildly bruised. If Grace never spoke to him again, he decided, he would still finish what he started, because for the first time in his adult life, the work itself, the sweat, the aching back, the honest tiredness at the end of a shift, had started to feel like it meant something. His foreman, a heavy-set man named Buddy Larson who had run the loading dock for 22 years, pulled him aside one afternoon and asked him plainly why a man with a helicopter on standby was still showing up at 6 in the morning to stack feed bags for $11 an hour. Daniel did not have a clean answer. He told Buddy the truth, that he did not know how to explain it in a way that would not sound like an insult to every man on that dock who had no helicopter to fall back on, no fortune waiting for him if the whole thing fell apart. Buddy considered this for a long moment, spat once into the gravel, and told him that as far as he was concerned, a man's worth got decided by what he did after people found out the truth about him, not by what he had before. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was the closest thing to it Daniel had received from anyone in town that week, and he carried it with him for the rest of the season. Eli was the one who broke first. 8 years old and missing his rock-skipping lessons, he asked his mother one evening at dinner why Daniel had stopped coming around, and whether it was because Eli had done something wrong. Grace felt her heart break for the second time in 2 weeks, this time for an entirely different reason. She had been so focused on protecting herself from being played for a fool that she had not fully considered what the lie had cost her son, a boy who had finally started to trust a man again after years of his father's broken promises. That night, after Eli fell asleep, Grace sat on her porch steps for a long time, the same steps where she and Daniel used to talk until the streetlights came on. She thought about every version of the story she had been telling herself since the article surfaced. She thought about the difference between a man who lies to take something from you and a man who lies because he has been taken from so many times that honesty stopped feeling safe. It did not excuse what he did, but it was starting to explain it. And Grace had spent enough years being angry at Marcus Doyle to know that anger without understanding tends to calcify into something that poisons you far longer than it ever punishes the person who hurt you. She found him at the feed mill on a Saturday morning, still in his work clothes, hauling bags off a delivery truck like every other man on the loading dock. He saw her before she said a word, and he set the bag down slowly, like he was afraid any sudden movement might make her disappear again. Grace did not run into his arms. She was not that kind of woman, and this was not that kind of story. Instead, she asked him one question, the only question that mattered to her anymore. "If I hadn't found out," she said, "would you have ever told me?" Daniel did not hesitate. He told her about the conversation he had rehearsed a dozen times, the one he never got the chance to have because the truth arrived first, uninvited, through a stranger's Facebook post instead of through his own mouth. He told her he had been terrified, not of losing his money or his image, but of losing the one place in his life where nobody wanted anything from him except his company on a porch step. Grace listened, and for the first time since the article surfaced, she let herself believe that fear and cowardice were not always the exact same thing. It took months, not days, for what they had to rebuild into something Grace could trust again. Daniel did not try to buy his way back into her life, and that mattered more to her than she ever told him directly. He did not send flowers from an expensive florist in Knoxville. He did not offer to pay off her mortgage or fund Eli's entire college education in one grand gesture meant to erase 3 months of dishonesty. Instead, he kept showing up. He kept working at the mill until the season's harvest was done. He kept walking her home in bad weather, 2 steps beside her now instead of 2 steps behind. There was a night, about 2 months into their slow reconciliation, when Grace finally asked him the question she had been avoiding since the day at the mill. She wanted to know what would have happened if the reporter had never found him, if the photograph had never surfaced, if Millbrook Hollow had simply let him live out his quiet lie indefinitely. Daniel thought about lying to her one more time, telling her something easy, something that would make him look better. Instead, he told her the truth, which was that he honestly did not know, and that the uncertainty of it kept him up more nights than he cared to admit. Grace respected that answer more than any confident promise he could have offered. She had spent enough of her life around men who were certain of everything and right about nothing. Slowly, the town stopped talking about the billionaire who had lied to a waitress and started talking about the man who had chosen to stay even after every reason to run had presented itself. Daniel eventually told Grace the rest of it, the parts even the reporter had not known, about his father building the company from a single hardware store much like the one where he had rented his room, about the loneliness that comes with being handed an empire before you ever get the chance to build your own character alongside it. Grace began to understand that the disguise had not been a cruel game. It had been the only honest thing a man like Daniel knew how to do, strip away everything false in his life to find out what was left underneath. If you have ever wondered whether real love can survive the truth coming out sideways instead of gently, this story is proof that it depends entirely on what 2 people do after the truth lands. Grace could have closed that door forever, and by every reasonable measure of self-protection, she would have been justified. Daniel could have taken the article as an excuse to disappear back into his old life, wealthy and untouched and alone, the way he had been for years before Millbrook Hollow. Neither of them took the easy road. That, more than the money, more than the lie, more than the headlines, is what eventually convinced Grace to let him back into her life and into her son's. They married the following autumn, in a small ceremony at the same church on the corner 3 blocks from the diner, not the ballroom Daniel's mother had once imagined for her only son. Grace kept working at the Hollow Diner for another 2 years after the wedding, not because she needed the money anymore, but because she was not the kind of woman who abandoned people the moment her circumstances changed. Daniel eventually told the truth publicly, not through a curated press release, but through a short, unpolished interview where he admitted every uncomfortable detail of what he had done and why. It did not make him look perfect. It made him look human, which turned out to matter far more to the people watching than perfection ever could have. Eli got his marine biology books for his 10th birthday, along with a promise from Daniel that they would visit the actual ocean together that summer, a promise that was kept. They drove all the way to the Gulf Coast in a rented pickup truck instead of flying private, because Daniel wanted Eli's first sight of the ocean to come after hours of anticipation through a windshield, the way most kids in Millbrook Hollow experienced it, not delivered instantly, and without effort the way everything in his old life used to arrive. Eli talked about that trip for years afterward, though not about the ocean itself nearly as much as he talked about the gas station diner where they stopped for lunch, where Daniel let him order 3 desserts and did not once check the bill. The feed mill still has Daniel's old employee badge hanging in the break room, a joke among the crew that has since become something closer to a point of pride, proof that a man can walk into a small town with nothing and still be humbled by exactly how much it takes to earn what most people build slowly over an entire lifetime. Buddy Larson still tells new hires the story every autumn during harvest season, usually leaving out Daniel's last name until the very end, just to watch their faces when the truth lands. Grace never did get an apology grand enough to erase what those months of deception cost her, and Daniel never once expected one to be enough. What they built instead, brick by brick and shift by shift, was something sturdier than an apology. It was proof, day after ordinary day, that he had meant every word he said on her porch steps in the rain. Sometimes the truest love does not arrive wrapped in perfect honesty from the very first conversation. Sometimes it survives despite the lie, because what grows underneath it turns out to be real enough to outlast the deception that first covered it. If this story moved you, if you believe kindness should never be a test, but sometimes becomes one anyway, stay with us. There are more stories like Grace and Daniel's waiting for you. Stories about the quiet dignity of people who give without expecting anything back, and the strange, complicated ways love finds its way to the people who deserve it most. Subscribe and walk with us through the next one.